A man is dying in a hospital bed, and the people standing over him are not doctors. They are former prisoners of the camp. He ran for 6 years. He is talking, and he cannot stop talking because he knows this is the last night of his life and he has nothing left to protect. Standing a few feet away is an American colonel, watching this happen, choosing not to intervene. What that colonel does next, and more importantly, what he refuses to do, is the reveal that turns this from a war story into something far stranger. Because in a few hours, a wounded Nazi commandant will hand his own former prisoners the one piece of evidence that reaches all the way into a Dachau courtroom a year later and helps hang men he never even named directly. Stay with me, because the twist in this story isn't the interrogation. It's what happens to the words after the man who said them is already dead. His name was Franz Zierreis, and for 6 years he was the commandant of Mauthausen, a concentration camp carved into a granite quarry in the Austrian hills. Mauthausen wasn't built like some of the other camps you've heard about. It wasn't primarily a machine for mass gassing on an industrial schedule, at least not at first. It was built around a different kind of cruelty, exhaustion turned into a weapon. The SS itself classified Mauthausen internally as the harshest grade in the entire camp system, a place reserved for prisoners it considered the most dangerous, the most political, the most disposable. And the centerpiece of that cruelty was a staircase. 186 stone steps carved into the quarry wall, where prisoners hauled blocks of granite strapped to their backs, climbing again and again until their legs gave out. Survivors called it the Stairs of Death. Guards reportedly bet on how long a man could last before he collapsed under the weight. Some prisoners, driven past what a human body can endure, are said to have thrown themselves off the edge of the quarry rather than climb it one more time. Zierreis wasn't a distant administrator signing forms from an office somewhere safely removed from all of this. He walked those quarry grounds personally. He is documented as having taken part in executions himself, not simply ordered them from behind a desk. Under his command, tens of thousands of people died at Mauthausen, shot, gassed, starved, worked into the ground on that staircase. Zierreis wasn't some career fanatic who had spent his whole life inside the Nazi machine. He was born in 1905, worked as a department store apprentice and a messenger boy as a teenager, studied commerce in the evenings, then spent over a decade as a soldier in the German army, rising to sergeant before his discharge in 1936. That same year, he joined the SS. Within a year, he was commanding a Totenkopfverbände unit, the Death's Head formations that would go on to staff the concentration camp system. By February of 1939, at just 33 years old, he was appointed Commandant of Mauthausen, a position he would hold for the rest of the camp's existence. This wasn't a man who fell into atrocity by accident or bureaucratic drift. It was a steady, deliberate climb, one promotion at a time, from a department store floor to command of one of the most brutal camps in the entire Nazi system. By the spring of 1945, with the war collapsing around him, Zierreis did what a lot of men in his position were doing. He ran. On the 3rd of May, he slipped away from the camp with his wife and their 3 children and headed for a hunting lodge in the mountains near a town called Spittel am Pyren, the kind of remote alpine retreat wealthy Austrians had been using for generations, and would keep using long after this war was over. Sit with that image for a second, because it matters before we go any further. A man responsible for tens of thousands of deaths was hiding out in a cozy mountain lodge with his family, while back at the camp he had just abandoned, American soldiers were discovering exactly what he had left behind. He stayed hidden there for almost 3 weeks, waiting, presumably, for the chaos of total collapse to settle into something he could quietly vanish inside of. The same hope that thousands of other SS officers were clinging to that spring, changing names, forging papers, crossing borders, starting over as nobody. It almost worked for Zierreis, too. It didn't work because of who came looking for him. In the final weeks of May, an American patrol tracked him down to that lodge. But the soldiers weren't the only ones on that patrol. Riding with them were former prisoners of Mauthausen, men who knew this commandant's face, who knew exactly what he had done, and who had been waiting a very long time for a moment like this one. When the patrol caught up to him, the official account says Zierreis was shot while attempting to escape. If that phrase sounds familiar, it should. It shows up again and again across the collapse of the Third Reich that spring. And it's the kind of sentence that can mean precisely what it says, or can mean something considerably less official happened in those woods, witnessed by men who had every reason on earth not to let this particular prisoner walk calmly into a courtroom months later. Whatever actually happened in those first minutes, Zierreis didn't die on the spot. He was alive, badly wounded, and he was carried to a hospital at Gusen, one of Mauthausen's own subcamps, now sitting under American control. This is the point where the story stops being a manhunt and turns into something almost nobody expects. Picture the room itself for a moment, because the setting matters as much as the words spoken inside it. This wasn't an interrogation cell with bare walls and a single light bulb. It was a hospital ward, the kind of place built for healing, now holding the man who had spent 6 years personally overseeing the opposite of healing at Mauthausen. He was lying down, wounded, likely in and out of full alertness as blood loss and shock set in. And gathered around that bed were men who, a few weeks earlier, would have been shot on sight for standing this close to him without permission. For 6 to 8 hours through the night, as Zereis lay dying, he was interrogated, not by a military prosecutor building a legal case file, not with a court stenographer taking down an official transcript for a tribunal. He was questioned by Hans Marsalek, a former Mauthausen prisoner who had survived the very camp Zereis had commanded, sitting in that room alongside Colonel Richard Seibel, the American officer whose 11th Armored Division now controlled the camp, a Polish survivor of the same camp, and a doctor who had also once been a prisoner there, a man forced for years to treat the machinery of a system now watching one of its own architects bleed out in front of him. A dying commandant, surrounded almost entirely by the people he had spent years terrorizing, with one American officer present, apparently there to supervise whatever this was, and never fully explaining, even decades later, exactly what role he thought he was playing in that room. And Zereis talked. According to Marsalek, he confessed freely, because by that point he knew he wasn't going to survive the night. And a dying man with nothing left to lose sometimes tells the truth, simply because there's no longer any reason not to. What came out of him, according to the account later put on paper, was an unfiltered catalog of what had actually happened inside Mauthausen. The systematic killing of Jewish prisoners, executions carried out on his own orders, the camp's use of a mobile gas van alongside its fixed gas chamber, the forced death marches that emptied satellite camps in the war's final weeks, a brothel operated inside the camp using female prisoners, the tattooing and marking system used to track inmates like inventory rather than human beings, and, among the darkest claims attributed to him that night, the use of human skin taken from murdered prisoners to bind books and make small leather goods for SS officers. That last claim deserves a pause, because this is exactly the kind of detail where honesty matters more than shock value. It's horrifying. It's attributed directly to a dying man in a documented interrogation, and it also sits in a category of Holocaust-era testimony that historians have learned to treat with real caution, because similar allegations at other camps were later found to be exaggerated, misattributed, or impossible to independently verify with physical evidence. We're telling you what the confession says he said. We are not telling you every detail of it has been proven beyond dispute with physical evidence, because it hasn't, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty, the exact kind this channel refuses to traffic in. Most of the rest of what he described, though, lines up closely with what investigators, survivors, and later trial testimony independently confirmed about how Mauthausen actually operated, which is part of what makes this confession so hard to simply dismiss, and part of what makes the question of its authorship matter so much. Zereis died on the evening of the 24th of May, 1945, roughly a day and a half after the interrogation ended. Marsalek's account was handed over to Colonel Seibel and would later be cited in the war crimes proceedings that followed, entered into the historical record as testimony from a man who no longer had any reason left to lie. Except here's the detail most retellings of this story skip straight past, and it's the one that actually changes everything you just heard. Colonel Seibel, the American officer who was physically in that room, who watched the entire interrogation unfold from start to finish, later refused to sign the written confession that Marsalek eventually produced. Not immediately either. 10 months later, from memory, Marsalek sat down and wrote out what he recalled Zereis saying that night. And it's that reconstructed document, not a signed contemporaneous transcript taken in the room, that ended up circulating afterward as the confession. Seibel wouldn't put his name to it. He also declined later to testify about it at Nuremberg. And there is a competing account from other people who claim to have been present that night, insisting that Zereis never actually regained full consciousness after his wounds and never gave any coherent statement to his captors at all, meaning the entire confession, as we know it today, may be, at least in part, reconstructed testimony rather than a verbatim record of a dying man's last words. So ask yourself what that means about the scene we just walked through together. An American colonel sat in a room, watched a wounded, dying war criminal get questioned for 6 to 8 hours by his own former prisoners instead of any recognizable legal process. And then, when it came time to put his name on paper and vouch for what had been said, he simply wouldn't do it. That refusal is not a footnote. That refusal is the entire case for reasonable doubt, delivered by the single most credible, most neutral witness available in that room. And here's where this particular story earns its title, because the reveal isn't the confession itself. The reveal is what an American officer chose to do and chose not to do once he realized what he was actually witnessing. He didn't stop the interrogation. He let a wounded man be questioned through the night by people with every human reason to want a certain kind of answer. But when the moment came to certify that answer as fact, to attach his own name and reputation to it, he pulled back. He handed authorship of history to the victims in that room and then refused to co-sign what they wrote. That's not cowardice, and it's not complicity either. It might be the most honest thing anyone did in that entire building that night. A soldier who understood, even in the moment, that what was happening in front of him wasn't justice in any courtroom sense, and who wasn't willing to launder it into something it wasn't just by putting his signature underneath it. Now here's the part that should really stop you, because it's the part almost nobody tells. What actually happened in that hospital room stays genuinely uncertain to this day, and yet it didn't stay quarantined to that one room. Nearly a year later, in March of 1946, the United States opened the main Mauthausen trial at Dachau. 61 defendants, camp officials, and guards standing in front of an American military tribunal to answer for what had happened at Mauthausen and its subcamps. 58 of them were sentenced to death, and woven into the case against several of those men was testimony traced directly back to what Zierreis reportedly said in that hospital bed the night he died, including the identification of Dr. Edward Krebsbach, one of the camp's physicians, as the man responsible for operating the gas chamber, and the naming of Victor Wasicki as the person who handled and distributed the Zyklon B used inside it. A dying commandant's disputed, unsigned, never testified to confession helped point prosecutors toward the men who actually pulled the levers of the gas chamber at Mauthausen. Whatever really happened in that room, whatever Seibel's silence was actually protecting or concealing, the words that came out of it reached across a year and into a courtroom and helped send other men to the gallows. Dr. Edward Krebsbach is worth knowing a little more about, because his fate closes the loop on this story in a way that almost feels too neat to be true, except it's documented. Prisoners at Mauthausen had a nickname for him, Dr. Spritzbach, roughly Dr. Injection, earned because he was responsible for killing sick and disabled prisoners with lethal injections directly to the heart, and because he oversaw the construction of a gas chamber built into the basement of the camp hospital, a facility under his own medical authority that murdered hundreds of people. Krebsbach was sentenced to death at that same 1946 Dachau tribunal, and on the 28th of May, 1947, almost exactly 2 years to the week after Zierreis died in that hospital bed at Gusen, he was hanged at Landsberg prison. The commandant who ran the camp gave a disputed, unsigned account of what happened inside it. A year later, a tribunal that leaned in part on that account sent the camp's own doctor to the gallows for exactly the crimes Zierreis had described. Whatever you believe about how reliable that hospital bed confession really was, its consequences were not disputed at all. They were final. Let that sink in for a second, because it's a strange, uncomfortable kind of justice. A piece of evidence nobody in an American uniform would formally vouch for still shaped a real trial with real verdicts and real executions. If Zierreis' confession was substantially true, then an act of pure vengeance. A wounded man interrogated by the people he tormented, with no defense counsel, no judge, no rules of evidence in that room, ended up doing something a formal courtroom process might never have managed on its own. It identified perpetrators who might otherwise have blended back into the post-war chaos and disappeared. But if the confession was partly or wholly reconstructed, shaped by grief and rage and 10 months of memory doing exactly what memory does under those conditions, then men were tried in part on the word of a document the one neutral witness in the room refused to endorse. Both of those things can be true, and historians still don't agree on where the real weight sits. Consider how strange this actually is if you step back from it entirely. In any functioning legal system, nearly everything about that hospital room would disqualify whatever came out of it as evidence. The interrogators weren't neutral parties. They were direct victims of the man they were questioning, with every reason on earth to want him to say exactly what he said. The subject was dying, in pain, almost certainly not in a state to carefully weigh his own words, the way a defendant preparing testimony under normal conditions would be. There was no defense counsel present, no judge, nothing resembling due process in any sense a courtroom would recognize as legitimate. And the one person in that room wearing an American uniform, the one man with genuine institutional authority, made the deliberate choice afterward not to attach his name to any of it. And yet the substance of what was said still traveled forward, still mattered, still shaped verdicts. There's a version of this story where the American soldiers are simply the heroes who finally ran a monster to ground after 3 weeks of hiding, delivered him into the hands of people who had more than earned the right to see him face some form of consequence, and let history sort out the rest. There's real truth sitting inside that version, and it shouldn't get buried under everything that came after it. Nobody forced Zierreis into hiding in a mountain lodge with his family instead of surrendering openly and facing whatever process was coming for him. Nobody made him run that camp the way he ran it for 6 years. Personally, on the ground, present for the punishments, not from behind a desk, safely removed from the killing. The Americans who tracked him down through 3 weeks of alpine terrain on thin intelligence, with no guarantee he was even still in the area, did something that actually mattered. They found a man who had spent years believing he might simply vanish into the post-war chaos the way so many others managed to. New name, forged papers, a quiet life somewhere nobody was looking. They made sure he never got that chance. That's not nothing. That's the kind of patient, unglamorous work that rarely makes it into the highlight reel of how the war ended, and it deserves to be said plainly before we go anywhere near the more uncomfortable part of what came next. But there's a harder version sitting right next to that one, and it's the version this channel exists to sit inside of rather than looking away from. A wounded, dying man, interrogated for hours through the night by the very people he had tormented, with the one neutral witness in the room later refusing to certify what was actually said, and that unresolved, unsigned testimony still going on to help convict other men a year later in a real American courtroom. Call that justice finally arriving on its own terms, years before due process could have caught up with it, or call it something else entirely. A confession partly written by grief, laundered into a courtroom through the sheer weight of its own horror, with nobody left alive to challenge it, and nobody in uniform willing to stand fully behind it either. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Because historians are still arguing about this, and I really don't think there's a clean answer. When testimony born out of pure, unsupervised vengeance, extracted from a dying man by his own victims, in a room with no judge, no defense, and no rules, goes on to help convict other men in a real trial a year later, does the result matter more than the method? Or does the method poison everything that came after it, no matter how many of the men it helped convict were guilty? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read every single one, and I want to know where you actually draw that line. What happened to Zirice's family is its own small, separate footnote, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we close this out. His wife and 3 children, hiding with him in that lodge, right up until the moment the patrol arrived, were not soldiers, were not SS, had committed no documented crime of their own beyond sharing a name and a roof with a man the world had every reason to want gone. War has a way of drawing lines that refuse to stay clean, catching people up in consequences that were never really theirs to answer for. And that particular thread of the story almost never gets told at all, buried underneath the far more dramatic scene unfolding in the hospital room a few miles away. Here's the thing that stays with me most about this entire case, months after first reading through the trial records. It isn't the staircase, and it isn't even the confession itself. It's Colonel Seibel's silence. A man who watched something happen, who could have simply gone along with the version everyone around him wanted to be true, and instead chose to withhold his name from it. Not to protect Zirice, and not really to protect the former prisoners either, but maybe just to protect the difference between what he knew for certain and what he merely believed. That's a harder kind of integrity than the one we usually put in the highlight reel of history, the kind that doesn't come with a clean verdict attached to it, and it's exactly the kind of detail that gets erased the moment a story gets simplified into heroes and monsters. If stories like this are the kind of history you actually want more of, the uncomfortable kind that refuses to hand you a tidy verdict and doesn't let anyone in the room off the hook completely, subscribe to the channel, because this is exactly the territory we keep coming back to week after week. And if this one actually got under your skin, if you found yourself rooting for the room full of former prisoners in one breath and unsettled by what that room actually was in the next, hit like before you go. It helps this reach more people who think they already know exactly how these stories end, when most of the time they really don't. We'll be back soon with the next one.